So let me tell you who disagrees with that. 35 states across the country disagree with that because 35 states have voter ID laws in effect. But not just 35 states. 81% of voters in America disagree with the radical views proposed by the Democrats and the Democratic witnesses. Not just 81% of Americans. 77% of black voters in America support voter ID laws. 78% of Hispanic voters in America support voter ID laws. Maldev should think about that. 81% of low-income Americans support voter ID laws. And yet, what this bill is about is putting radicals in charge of saying, if you require an ID to vote, that is racist and must be struck down. This is all about partisan.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to KRI Reacts. I just watched a congressional hearing that felt less like a debate and more like a game of political dodgeball. Senator Ted Cruz asked one very simple question. Are voter ID laws racist? Sounds straightforward, right? Well, somehow that question sent half the room into a maze of it depends, in some cases, and maybe theoretically. Today, we're breaking down the exact moment Cruz pressed these witnesses and why their answers might surprise you. If you enjoy straight talk and honest political reactions, make sure you hit like, subscribe to KRI Reacts, and let's get into it.
And turn to the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to start with a question for each of the five witnesses. In your judgment, are voter ID laws racist? Professor Tolson.
Thank you for that question. So it depends. One thing we have to stop doing is treating all voter ID laws as the same.
Okay, so your answer, I want to move quickly, so it depends is your answer?
Yes, that's my answer.
Okay, so what voter ID laws are racist?
Apologies, Mr. Cruz, your state of Texas, perhaps?
Okay, so you think the entire state of Texas is racist. What about requiring an ID to vote is racist?
So I think, sir, that's pretty reductive. I'm not saying the entire state of Texas is racist.
You just said my state of Texas, so you tell me, what about the Texas voter ID laws is racist?
So the fact that the voter ID law was put into place to diminish the political power of Latinos with racist intent and had been found to have
You're
racist
asserting
intent.
that. What's your evidence for that?
The federal district court that first resolved the constitutionality of Texas's voter ID law.
Okay, so your view is voter ID laws are racist. How about you, Mr. Yang?
I agree with Professor Tolson. Voter ID laws can be racist.
Okay, that's
in other
two.
contexts.
Mr. Sines?
There are some voter ID laws that are racially discriminatory in intent.
How about in practice? In intent, fine, you say there's some racist with a malevolent intent lurking in the back of their mind. But let's just talk about it as a practical matter. When I go to vote, they ask me for my ID. I pull out my ID, I show it to them, I vote. Is that racist?
If the law that requires you to do that was motivated by racially discriminatory intent
What about the
under
effect?
our
Set
Constitution.
aside intent. Set aside intent. I'm asking about the effect.
Yes, in effect,
Okay,
I think that
Mr.
there are
Reardon.
discriminatory effects from a number of voter ID laws.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Reardon.
I'm going to give the witness a chance to answer the question. Go ahead, Mr. Sines.
Yes, in effects, I think many voter ID laws are discriminatory. And in design, they are designed to have that effect.
Okay, Ms. Reardon.
No, sir.
Mr. Van Spakovsky.
No, particularly because every single state that has passed an ID law has put in a provision to provide a free ID to anyone who doesn't have one. The turnout numbers show it has no effect, and I would remind everyone that the current version of the Texas voter ID law for in-person voting, the Obama administration agreed in a court filing, that they were satisfied with it and that it was not discriminatory.
You know, I have to say this range of question actually shows the wildly partisan nature of the Democrats' proposal. The record should reflect all three of the Democratic witnesses invited by the chairman maintained to this committee that voter ID laws can be, in many instances, in most instances, I think of the various ways they formulated, are racist. So let me tell you who disagrees with that. 35 states across the country disagree with that because 35 states have voter ID laws in effect. But not just 35 states. 81% of voters in America disagree with the radical views proposed by the Democrats and the Democratic witnesses. Not just 81% of Americans. 77% of black voters in America support voter ID laws. 78% of Hispanic voters in America support voter ID laws. Maldev should think about that. 81% of low-income Americans support voter ID laws. And yet, what this bill is about is putting radicals in charge of saying, if you require an ID to vote, that is racist and must be struck down. This is all about partisan power. Now, DOJ has also said, under the Biden administration, that it is not going to presume that a state acts lawfully if it simply returns to pre-COVID voting laws. Ms. Reardon, Mr. Van Spakovsky, what does that tell you if they say after a pandemic, if you go back to the laws that existed before, DOJ is not going to assume that that's okay. What does that tell you about the partisan nature of DOJ?
By issuing the guidance that they did, it says to me that what they would like to do is make permanent the emergency procedures that were instituted by many states through litigation by the DNC throughout the country prior to the 2020 election. And they would like those to be permanent. And so rather than understand that they are temporary, they are going to go after states that decide to go back to their original election procedures.
Well, and I think they also think Democrats did well under those emergency procedures, and so keeping those emergency procedures in place will predictably benefit Democrats. I would note, in addition to disagreeing with the vast majority of the American people, the Democratic witnesses and the Democrats here also disagree with the United States Supreme Court. When I was the Solicitor General of Texas, I represented a coalition of states defending Indiana's voter ID law. Before the U.S. Supreme Court, a group of plaintiffs challenged that. It went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, by a vote of 6-3, upheld Indiana's voter ID law. Not only did they do so, Justice John Paul Stevens, one of the lions of the left, wrote the majority opinion where he said voter ID laws protect the integrity of elections. And yet, sadly, too many Democrats today don't want to protect the integrity of elections. And I've got to say, there is a view, particularly from Northeastern Democrats, that they look down on the rest of the country as a bunch of bigots and overalls, their Southern cousins who are too oafish to be as enlightened as they are. And I have to say there's an incredible hypocrisy in that states like Georgia and Mississippi have a higher black voter registration rate than states like Connecticut, the chairman's home state. They have higher black voter turnout rates than states like Connecticut. They have a lower gap between black and white turnout than in states like Senator Blumenthal's Connecticut. And in fact, states like Georgia and Mississippi, African Americans vote at a higher rate than white voters, and in Texas, they're basically equal. One of the sad realities of today's Democratic Party is they define race as follows. If you're a Democrat, you qualify. So under the Democratic view, I'm not Hispanic. Senator Padilla is. If you're a Democrat, you're an Hispanic. My abuelo and abuela would be very surprised to discover I wasn't Hispanic. But that's how Democrat views it. That's how the radicals in the civil rights division view it, and I will point out it as an example. This committee, one federal district judge in the state of Texas, Jason Pulliam, is an African-American judge nominated by President Trump, sat at this table, presented superbly. The Democrats had no criticism, and every single Democrat on this committee voted against him. Why? Because they perceived him as a black Republican. He didn't qualify as a black man, and I actually asked, as the Democrats were voting against Judge Pulliam, do you have one basis to vote against him? Anything you disagree with? None of them had any single answer at all. This hearing's about one thing. It's about power, and it's about ensuring Democrats stay in power. That's cynical, and it's at the expense of democracy and the right of voters to express their will through free and fair elections.
I'm going to ask my questions now and just begin by saying this hearing has nothing to do with any geographic discrimination, any idea that one state or another is oafish.
So here's the moment that had the entire hearing turning awkward. Senator Ted Cruz turns to the panel of witnesses and asks a very direct question. Are voter ID laws racist? Now, you would think a question like that would get a clear yes or no. Instead, the first response he gets is basically, well, it depends. That's when Cruz jumps in and says he wants to move quickly and asks them to clarify, are they racist or not? One professor argues that certain voter ID laws were designed to reduce the political power of Latino voters, and says courts have previously found discriminatory intent behind some laws. But Cruz presses further. He asks something that millions of everyday voters are probably thinking. When someone goes to vote, they show an ID, driver's license, state ID, something basic. Is that act itself racist? Another witness answers that if a law was passed with discriminatory intent, then the requirement could be discriminatory in effect. But notice what's happening here. Cruz isn't asking about legal theories or historical court filings. He's asking about the real-world experience of voting, the reality that most Americans walk into a polling place, show identification, and vote. Then the responses start splitting. Some witnesses say certain voter ID laws could have discriminatory effects. Others say absolutely not. One witness points out something important. In many states, voter ID laws come with provisions that provide free identification for anyone who doesn't already have one. That means the barrier argument gets a lot more complicated. Cruz then brings up something that completely shifts the conversation: public opinion. According to polling he cites, roughly 81% of Americans support voter ID laws. That includes strong majorities of black voters, Hispanic voters, and low-income voters. And that's a key part of this debate, because while politicians argue about intent and legal frameworks, many voters across the political spectrum simply view ID as a basic safeguard for election integrity. Cruz also reminds the room that the United States Supreme Court previously upheld Indiana's voter ID law in a 6-3 decision. The majority opinion was written by Justice John Paul Stevens, who was not exactly known as a conservative firebrand. The court concluded that voter ID laws can help protect the integrity of elections. Now, whether you agree with Cruz or disagree with him, the exchange highlights something interesting about modern political debates. Often, the loudest arguments happen around simple questions. Is showing ID to vote reasonable security? Or is it a barrier that could affect certain groups more than others? Those are real questions people across the country are debating. But what made this moment go viral is how a simple question forced a room full of experts and political figures to carefully choose every word they said. And if there's one thing congressional hearings prove over and over again, it's this: sometimes the simplest question is the hardest one to answer. Let me know what you think in the comments. Should voter ID be required nationwide, or should voting rules stay entirely in the hands of individual states?